Welcome back to the Gamers of the Eastern Fringe podcast, a podcast all about enjoying your hobby. Well, listeners, today we have something special for you. This is a series of interviews with the winners of our 40K Summer League. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what that is, we've been covering it in our previous episodes, but basically the quick version is we ran our first event, a 40K Summer League. This was our first ITC scoring event. So as you participated, even though the pods are small, you got to earn some ITC points, get a ranking, and all that good stuff. We had 4 pods in total of 6 players each, 3 here in the Lehigh Valley and 1 out in Berks, which is another partnering group we work with. Now, the league has officially wrapped up, and we're eager to share with you a glimpse into that league experience through the eyes of those that came out on top and won ultimate victory. I have one of our winners today. I have Anthony Murphy with us, who won Pod 3. So, Anthony, why don't you say hello to the listeners and tell them a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Anthony Murphy. I've been playing Warhammer for just about as long as I can remember. I started out in Warhammer Fantasy a long time ago, migrated over to Warhammer 40K, but throughout the pandemic, I took a few years off and I've just come back in. So I used this particular summer league as a means to kind of springboard back into the local competition scene and meet some other people who play Warhammer and play around a little bit. So that's where I come from. That's my background. And I played Death Guard and did rather well with them, apparently. So.
Obviously, clearly. So don't be shy or humble about it. You came out on top, sir. So let's have some fun with it. So listeners, we're not going to mess around with this too much. We're going to go right into Anthony's list. He's going to take us through what he took, why he took it. Obviously, we can all take anything we want in a list, but he specifically composed this thing with competing in mind. So Anthony, you want to take us through your list?
Sure, yeah. So the cornerstone of this list is going to be the Plague Marines, right? And I've had 3 units of Plague Marines in this list. I used the whole Nurgle magic number of 7. No particular reason.
As you would, yeah, as you
just
would.
Because. So that's just my favorite kind of number. It's unfortunately makes them vulnerable to the first tier of blast weaponry, right? And so, but in any case, I had 2 units of basic shooting Marines, 1 plasma gun each. They had the Sigil of Decay, so it makes 6s to hit on their bolters automatically wound whatever it is that they're firing at. That is extremely helpful. But then the 3rd unit of Plague Marines was equipped entirely for melee, and I'll get into that a little bit later. They were inside of a Rhino for fast transport about whatever board that we were using. I had, let's see, I got my list up here. Of course, we had, you can't leave home without your fetid bloat drones. I had 3 of those. Those have served me well ever since they were released. I had 2 shooting type bloat drones with the double plague squirters and 1 flesh mower. And the flesh mower did surprisingly well.
I'd imagine it did.
Oh, it certainly did. It has a lot more attacks than I'd give it credit for, and the 2 damage apiece really helps. Couple of hell brutes, couple of the foul blight spawns. The foul blight spawns were the MVP of at least 2 of the 5 matches that I played through. 3 of the Death Shroud Terminators, they deep struck with my Warlord in the backfield. Get some extra points for behind enemy line secondary, as well as being able to contest some backfield objectives. 2 Plague Burst Crawlers. The Plague Burst Crawlers, obviously, same as the Fetid Bloat Drones. They're just incredible at being able to do what you need them to do. Extremely tough. I'm not entirely sure if, to memory, I don't believe that anybody destroyed them except for my final match against the Tyranids, and I was facing down on Tyrannifex with some sort of rupture cannon weapon that could snipe them out in 1 hit. So, and then the Chaos Rhino as well to ferry around the melee Plague Marines, as well as the Foul Blight spawn, and then I also had a Malignant Plague Caster as well that was also in the Rhino. So the Rhino was packed full. I had to make sure in the course of my games that I kept that Rhino very safe, because if it ever got detonated before the troops got out of it, I was in serious trouble. So that's a snapshot.
So. yeah. But again, Death Guard being the endurance machines that they are, plus you benefited from the whole armor contempt buff that came along the way. Yeah, your army had some stuff. Now, listeners, obviously we will be posting this in the show notes so you can take a look at it yourselves. But Anthony did begin with 11 CP, just burning 1 of his CP on one of his troops, one of his Plague Marine. So that was exactly what he was going with, and yeah, it looks good. And your warlord, I'm looking at the notes, was your Lord of Contagion, which makes perfect sense. He's going to do some work and be hard to kill.
Do some work. That's the idea.
Exactly. So it just looking at it myself. I mean, obviously this kind of makes sense. Plague Marines got very good. They were obviously something that was kind of sidelined for a while. We saw just a ton of stuff that was nothing but Death Shroud Terminators in mass. But now with the buff to Armor Contempt and the fact that you now get War Gear options, all those beautiful bits that never got used, now make good returns. So it sounds like a really interesting hammer and anvil approach. I mean, you have some fast moving stuff with the photo bloat drones, moving up, able to either hose you down with horrible plague spitters or literally lawn mow you with its flesh mower. So it sounds like you got some early threats that can get to the enemy lines quick. And then, of course, your army is just going to slowly advance. And if you can't deal with them, they're eventually going to touch your opponent's army and really do some horrible things. So
that's right. That's exactly right. So the idea, strategically, the idea with this army is precisely what you just mentioned. You use the bloat drones and the shooting capability that it does have in order to eliminate the things that are going to cause threats to your ability to contest objectives. So you take the Poxwalkers, you take the Plague Marines, and you squat them onto objectives, and you start earning points every single turn. It's very difficult for opponents to move them because they've got the 2 wounds apiece, they've got the Armor of Contempt, they've got Toughness 5. The Malignant Plague Caster can further buff their strength and toughness by +1 each, move them up to toughness 6 if need be. His other psychic ability is -1 to hit them. So if you really want to hold an objective, you throw both of those on a unit. Now you're looking at toughness 6 with a 3+ armor save, Armor of Contempt, 2 wounds apiece, and -1 to hit them.
Beautiful.
Put them in cover on top of that, and you've got a unit that's not going anywhere anytime soon.
I'd imagine not. Now, the only odd thing that jumped out at me from your list, and I'm wondering if it's just points, was you had 11 Poxwalkers. Was that just a points thing?
It was just a points thing. I was like, I've got the points. I may as well just throw a dude on there. So
yeah, because you had mentioned about the Plague Marines being in units of 7. That obviously that brings them into the first bracket of blast weapons. But obviously an 11 puts the Poxwalkers into full blast. But I imagine if you lose some Poxwalkers, you're not going to weep over them incessantly.
No.
So. Yeah, well, there's the list, listeners, and obviously it did some work. So what we want to move into next is, here's the list, but how did it perform? Obviously, we know the end of this tale, that Anthony came out on top amid all of his matches. Anthony, what was your record, just so the listeners get to know?
I finished this season, this league 5-0. So I won 5 games and lost none.
A full undefeated record. How about
full
that?
Undefeated.
And the other thing, folks, before we move on to game recaps, just so you know, in this league, obviously we mentioned that Anthony's list had 11 CP, so you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, they stayed with the Warzone Nachmund did, and that was the whole thing. We had a discussion in the middle of the league. Obviously, Warzone Nephilim dropped right in the middle of the league's activities, and our leadership team kind of got together and decided to let each pod amid its players decide if they would like to readapt to the new season and obviously change some lists accordingly, or continue in this. And obviously, in this case, we had this pod stick with the prior season, which made sense. I mean, some lists, including my own, I'm in pod 2, would have really had to be revamped just to match the new secondaries, to match some of the new points. And so, that's why, in case listeners are wondering why we're talking about 11 CP when you start with 6, Anthony didn't net himself this much CP somehow, some way. So
nothing magical. There was nothing untoward. It was so in essence, yeah. So with the new changes that came, some lists would have to be radically redrawn. My list would not necessarily have to be radically redrawn. I can tell you what I'd do differently with the updated list.
We'll get to that at the end. Don't worry. We want to hear about your games first. Don't worry.
We'll head into that later.
Anthony, you're just getting ahead of me. That's okay. But save it for the listeners at the end, what you change. So now, Anthony, as we talk about some games, what I'd love for you to do is just give the listeners a chance to hear some of those most memorable moments from each of your games. So tell us, who were your opponents? What did you like about those games? What went well? What did you really learn? Did anybody give you a real squeeze of a match? Obviously, you came out on top in every one of them, but tell the listeners a little bit about your experience. How were your games?
Sure. So first round of the league, I played against Sisters of Battle.
Okay.
And they actually had a lot more powerful shooting than I thought they would.
Yes, they do.
The first time I've seen them in a long time on the table. And so it was interesting to play against them. I ended up tabling the army, but we had a great game. I wouldn't say that there was necessarily anything of particular highlight during that match. Second match of the season, I was playing against let's see, who was the second match? It was Black Templar. And the Black Templar.
Yeah, it was Dave.
Dave Anderson, yeah. Yes. And I tell you what, he knows exactly what he's doing with those Black Templar.
Yes, he does. I got to see a little bit of one of those matches.
Did
that
you?
thing was
Good.
Brutal.
Yep.
Yes.
He that was a very, very close match. I ended up tabling him too, but that was down to the wire, really. It was that went all the way to the final turn of the game.
Gotcha.
So that was really tough. My Plague Marines were very hard pressed to counter that, but the way that he has subsequently updated his list in post league, but the way that I countered that specific list was I looked across the table and I thought, if those melee Marines get to me, he has a big chunk of melee Marines that with the chain swords and whatnot, as Black Templar want to do.
As they do, yes, as they crusade.
And and I thought to myself, if those come across the table and make contact with me, I'm going to have a real problem. So I focused those down first. And once those went away, then then it kind of like got a lot easier on the tabletop for me. The second thing about that match was that he had the, what was it? They're Marines with plasma. I don't remember the name of it, but
the Inceptors.
The Inceptors. There we go.
Yes.
So he unfortunately made the mistake, and I think in hindsight he obviously wouldn't do this, but he made the mistake of trying to charge my Foul Blight spawn with the Incessors.
Ooh,
and
okay.
And so he did that, fired Overwatch with the Foul Blight spawn and rolled maximum hits, and it just wiped them all. So so that was that. But yeah, he was definitely one of my top competitors in this league for sure.
Good. And you mentioned your prior opponent. That was Adriana. I know some.
Asher, yeah.
Yep, I know some of the
Adriana Sweet. Sorry.
Sweet, that's right. Yeah, Asher's the dad. Sweet's the last. That's
dad,
right.
Yep.
Yeah. So Asher, good morning to you as well.
Hey,
I'll
get to him in a minute.
That's right. So you had Sisters of Battle. You had Black Templars. Who else did you play?
So I played Tau.
Okay.
And the Tau, those railguns hit hard.
Yes,
really
they do.
hard.
Yes, they do. I believe that was Rob Brown, if I remember correctly.
That was Rob Brown. Yeah, that's correct. And we had a great game, a lot of fun. Ended up tabling him as well, but that was close. There was an objective he had where he could get to the corners of the board and score points that way. He'd do some sort of an action.
Oh yes, the Tau secondary. Yep.
Right, and so that netted him some points doing that because he wants to be back away from the action anyway as Tau in order to fire, control the board with overlapping fields of fire and so on. So I was hard pressed with him to get clear lines of where I was going to move my stuff, because of course his firepower as Tau is very high strength, so it sort of counters my high endurance. I've got high toughness and lots of armor with the Death Guard. So what I had to do in that particular match was force multiple engagements for him. So in other words, if with his railgun's only going to be able to fire at one target at a time. So I knew that if I put both of my Plague Burst crawlers with a clear line of sight of his, not the Devilfish, the Hammerheads.
Yes.
The Hammerhead tanks, he was only going to be able to shoot one of them a turn per railgun that he had. I think he had Correct. 2 railguns or something. He
did.
But in exchange, of course, my entropy cannons would have line of sight of these Hammerheads as well. And if I got rid of the Hammerheads, he's not going to be able to deal with the bloat drones and the Plague Burst crawlers and my high endurance Marines and so on. So that's how I handled that match. A lot of fun, a lot of good times on that one. And then the next match, unfortunately, was a stand-in match because the guy who was in that place had to drop the league. He sold his home and moved away. So they had another guy come in. It was Nathan Bodie, I think is his name.
Yes. Yep.
And he played Space Wolves.
Ooh,
And
even more combat. We're talking 2 combat Marine armies.
oh yeah,
all right.
We're talking about the the mashed potatoes on the board, because it was the list he brought was 2 units of 5 Thunderwolf cavalry, and he brought the chapter master guy, Logan Grimnar, I think his name is, or something like that, in the wolf chariot. And then he brought another special character on a wolf that gave everybody +1 attack. And then some various Marines on foot. But the main gist of his army was to come in hard right off the bat, turn 1. He's got 10 Thunderwolf cavalry charging straight into my line.
They move and they'll get there. That's right.
So he made one of the 2 Thunderwolf cavalries made contact with my line, my battle line, on turn 1. And thankfully, I had thought, okay, I need to screen these guys out a little bit. So he came in and hit the Poxwalkers on turn 1, and then subsequently he would pile into combat further, as Space Wolves are wont to do. As soon as he made contact with my line, I remember thinking to myself, welcome to my parlor, because one of the things that Death Guard like is when people are in close unsupported.
Correct.
So he hit really, really hard, but on the same token, I'm going to take that hit like the anvil and then hammer with the rest of the stuff. That's exactly what I did. He wiped the Poxwalkers, but everything else that was in combat subsequent to his piling in fell back from that combat, and then I dropped the foul blight spawn out of the rhino and proceeded to shoot him with the plague sprayer stuff, and it just kind of evaporated the wolves from there. Once those on that particular list, once the Thunderwolf cavalry were dealt with, he didn't have a whole lot else left to hit me with. A couple of my drones tied up Logan on the other side of the board, and he didn't really do much with him other than, he had a secondary to where he could kill vehicles and monsters, and that netted him some points as I was sacrificing the drones to keep him over across the board. But yeah, that's how that match went. And then obviously in the final match of the game, that was against Asher Sweet, and that was by far my toughest matchup. Asher was playing Tyranids, and that came down. That game was a nail biter all the way to the very last minute of the match.
So those bugs gave you some trouble.
The bugs gave me trouble. So he had one of the things that scared me as the Death Guard is if something can outshoot my toughness and endurance, it causes me lots of problems. So he had a I think it's called the Tyrannofex.
Yep. And
it's got a rupture cannon. And for those who don't know what that is, it's a big cannon that shoots with a lot of strength and does a lot of wounds when it hits. So on none of my previous matches had anybody ever, even the Tau railgun, was not capable of punching a Plague Burst crawler off the board in a single shot. This thing did it. This Tyrannofex did that job well. So even though my Plague Burst crawler was in cover, it still got sniped off the board in a single hit. And so, and then my second one almost came very, very close. It was down to 3 wounds by the end of the game.
Okay.
So, he had a combination of raw, high strength firepower, lots of psychic. He had 4 or 5 things across the board that could do psychic tests, and he was throwing smites across the board like it was, just like, here's a smite, and here's a smite, and here's a smite. And for those who don't know, this is something that I found out during the match. Something I learned during this particular match is that when smite triggers, it's not a lump sum of damage. For example, if you smite something and you do d6 damage, suppose that you roll a 5 for the damage. It's not 5 mortal wounds in a lump sum. And this is important because for Death Guard, they have the -1 damage. Some Marine stuff does as well. So it's not you take 5 mortal wounds -1, you've got 4 mortal wounds. It's not like that. Mortal wounds are applied, apparently, I learned this during the match, they're applied in increments of 1. So if you roll a 5 on the d6 for a smite, you're taking 5 individual mortal wounds.
And so you can't decrease it to a 0.
You can't decrease it to a 0. So that's that's a big Achilles heel for the Death Guard, is that if you're taking mortal wounds, it's bypassing your toughness, bypassing your armor, bypassing if you have an invulnerable
Invulns,
save,
yep.
bypassing the disgustingly resilient. So it's just it's hitting him really, really hard. And the fact that he had so much smite, oof, it hit really hard like a train. So he had the rupture cannon with a lot of smite. He had some decent hand-to-hand combat. I wasn't too afraid of that because, again, in close is where the Death Guard like to be. So the mission that we were playing, the particular mission on that match, was the Scouring.
Okay, gotcha,
And so
gotcha.
for those who don't know, it's just a board. You play on the long ends of the board with your deployment zone, and in the middle, the right smack in the middle, there's one objective, and then there's two more objectives on the outsides of that, closer to
Okay.
your deployment zones. So he and I were looking at the middle objective, like, who's going to be the first to move over the top of that, because whoever it is going to, you're going to be hammered pretty significantly. So again, that match went on all the way to the very bitter end. I managed to eke out victory on that one, but only by 4 or 5 points. So I mean, really, that match could have gone either way. That was by far the toughest match. At the end of the match, when we were done, I said, "Oh, it feels like I've ran a marathon." It's just very, very difficult. Yeah, I used to play competitive chess, and it reminds me of, that match gave me the same sort of physical feeling as having sat through an entire tournament.
Mm, mm.
And coming up feeling just mentally and physically exhausted, but having a great time. Asher was an incredible opponent. Very, very sportsman-like dude. Would absolutely love to play him again. A lot of fun. So
Well, that's what we like to hear. I mean, the goal of all this, of course, is that you all have a good experience, and as a result of that, you want to play each other, because that's kind of the benefit. We're not just meeting somewhere out in California, for those that can fly or drive out and have an experience. These are folks in our area that we're
Yep.
going to probably see again in the local gaming stores and local tournaments, and certainly as Gamers of the Eastern Fringe does more events, we're hoping that you guys get to have those rematches in a clinch moment. So,
Oh yeah,
yeah.
good times.
Well, Anthony, I'm glad you had a good time in all of your matches. Just so folks know, of course, one of the key things to victory anymore is what secondaries did you run? So was there any commonalities you had with what you picked, or did you kind of base it upon each and every match? You picked a whole different slew of secondaries per game. What was your approach?
So there was a couple of secondaries that really stood out to me. That again, this league was my first time back into 40K in about 2 or 3 years. So I had been out for so long that a lot of these secondaries are new to me. And so as I played these games, I kind of adapted to what I enjoyed using more. And one of those was Grind Them Down.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're playing Death Guard, what Grind Them Down does, if you're using Grind Them Down, but especially for Death Guard, is if you kill more units in your opponent's force during your turn than they kill of yours, you score the Grind Them Down.
Yeah,
Now,
it's this battle round thing where you're trying to out kill each other per unit, but that's the kicker, is per unit. You
per
can't just,
unit.
yeah.
Yep. And so for Death Guard, that becomes especially good because everything that you have as Death Guard is especially durable.
Yes.
You get the high strength, multi wounds, disgustingly resilient for the -1 damage, and so on. So everything that you kill of your opponent is that much more difficult for them to make up in return to stop
Sure.
you from scoring that.
Sure.
So that's number one. Number two, behind enemy lines.
Oh, good one. Good one.
Behind enemy lines with the Death Guard is particularly easy to score because I can drop my Warlord and my Death Shroud Terminators from Deep Strike inside their deployment zone on turn 2 and start scoring that immediately.
Well, you have the artillery to also clear out a little drop zone, as it were, for
Yep.
them. You can say, okay, if there's something blocking my deep strike over there, I'm going to shoot that off, and next turn, if they don't counter and move something new over, I can just drop them in. And then
Yep.
I see what you mean, because yeah, it's for those that don't know, for that one, it is 2 points if you have 1 unit, 4 though if you have 2 or more units. So if you're
Correct.
dropping the Warlord and the Death Shroud, and those aren't exactly easy things to like shift once they're there.
Once they're there, yeah.
It's like, okay, do I have the firepower? And I certainly don't want to go over there and touch them in melee. So yeah, really the best way I imagine would be a lot of mortal wounds to kill those things off would be my approach.
A lot of mortal wounds.
If you drop that much in my back line, I'd be like, let me mortal wound that thing to death and get them out of here,
You got it.
and then deal with it. But
that's
awesome.
Exactly right. Yeah, and it's tough for people to generate that number of mortal wounds. to get them off the table, because you're
Yeah,
talking
unless
about quite a bit of wounds.
Yeah, you got to be a psychic
So,
army. That's not just, hey, I brought one Primaris Psyker as a
right.
Imperial Guard player, and I'm going to try to mortal wound spam Death Guard to death.
Right.
Okay. So we had grind them down. We had behind enemy lines. What was your
Yep.
third one that you would typically run?
So there is a secondary that is, let's see, what is it called? Thin their ranks is a good one for the Death Guard. So for folks who don't know, that's that you keep track of the number of things that you kill, the number of wounds that you've dealt, and so on. At the end of the game, you divide that by 10, and that's how many bonus points you get. For 4 out of my 5 games, I tabled my opponents. So I maxed out the score on that. So if you score at least 150 wounds worth of stuff, which is, it sounds like a lot, but it's really, if you take a look at somebody's list, it actually adds up really, really quick.
Sure, absolutely.
And that's another really, really good one for the Death Guard to take. Is everything that you kill is over the course of the game is earning you points. When you're wiping out people's objective cappers, their objective secured units, you're not only increasing the chances that you are going to contest those objectives, but simultaneously earning points toward the secondary as well.
Sure, yeah, you're doing both a primary scoring and a secondary scoring at the same time. That way. That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's an example of 3 that I chose some others as well, but those are some highlights as far as what in my experience during this league, what I found to be really helpful for the Death Guard.
Absolutely, and that makes sense, because I know obviously behind enemy lines has stuck around, grind them down has stuck around, and I believe it's no prisoners now is the new name for the one you're talking about. Where it's based upon the number of wounds killed, you keep that tally and you do the division thereafter, and you get some bonus points for getting over the 51 mark, over the 100 mark. So it actually becomes easy, like I said, if you look over at your opponent's list and get a rough idea of, okay, if I at least deal with most of this, I'm going to be scoring some solid points there. Now, Anthony, you had gotten to this early on, but so the big kind of end question we want to talk about with the listeners is, well, after a summer league's worth of battles, any changes you would be making to your list, and especially with the new season Warzone Nephilim that's in effect right now, any changes you'll be making to your list as you take it into its next set of battles?
Yeah, with the changes that came to the Death Guard, if people want to play Death Guard competitively, in previous times, one of the best ways to play Death Guard competitively was to take big fat blocks of, they're called it's not the Death Shrouded, they're called Blight Lord Terminators. So you take big 10-man blocks of these guys and just sit them down on an objective, and they're not ever going to move because nobody's going to be able to. Yeah, you just squat on the objective with them, and that's that. But that's the old way.
Yes,
it's still possible. You can still do it, and it's still really, really good. But with the new changes to Death Guard, all of the war gear for Plague Marines are free.
Yes, they are.
And so because of that, one of the things that I anticipate seeing, and how I would change this list, is instead of 7 Marines, I would crank it up to 10. So you'd have 10-man units of Plague Marines, and then just give them everything that they can take. Pack them full, just like, you're putting together a Big Mac sandwich or something, just everything on it. Just take everything that you possibly can. And then at that point, that Plague Marine unit is going to be good at shooting. It's going to be good at melee. It's going to be good. It has objective secured. You're going to have 20 wounds worth of models there, all with disgustingly resilient. At toughness 5 with a 3+ armor save, and so on and so on and so on. So that's number 1. That's the first thing that I would do, is crank those up to 10. And you can take points from elsewhere in the army to make up for that. The Poxwalkers make fantastic screens to stop people from deep striking in your back line and getting charges and so on and so forth. So I would take probably 2 units of 10 Plague Marines, max out their war gear, 2 more units of maxed out Poxwalkers as screens and backfield objective cappers and so on. And then the vehicles would probably stay mostly the same. You got to have the bloat drones are critical. They're absolutely difficult for any opponent, any list to deal with those. Having a counter for those is very difficult for any opponent to come up with. So I would bring those. One note about the Squirters is Armor of Contempt has dramatically dropped the effectiveness of the Plague Squirters.
Yes.
but they're still good, because anytime you're making your opponent roll dice to defend themselves, that's a good thing. So
Absolutely, and that auto hitting is helpful because that
the auto hitting is
bypasses,
good.
that bypasses all your initial rolling. You just go to rolling for wounds, and then, like you said, make your opponents roll some dice for saving.
Make your opponents roll dice. So yeah, I mean, we're in terms of what I would change about the list, the bloat drones wouldn't change at all. I'd take
Yep.
2 of the squirters and 1 of the flesh mowers. If I had the opportunity and the points, I might try to squeeze in 1 more of the plague burst crawlers, just because the damage output of those things is magnificent, especially with the entropy cannons. I know that in the past, competitive folks would sometimes run the double squirters on the plague burst
Yeah, the
crawlers and then
defensive
drive them up the
option.
board.
Yeah,
The defensive option, and just drive them straight up the board, shooting as you go, and cause problems for the opponent because they have to deal with them before they get there, or they're going to get squirted by these things. Nowadays, for this particular list, I needed something that was going to be able to handle the big stuff, and that's where the entropy cannons come in. And I wouldn't change that in a new list. Probably I would not change that. So
Sure.
hopefully that gives.
Yeah,
Yep.
and that kind of makes sense from your approach, saying about a hammer and anvil, that
Hammer and
if you're
anvil.
going to make more things melee focused in your army, to keep the entropy cannons as a shooting option, which Death Guard traditionally are not always known for,
Right.
to have a lot of good solid shooting options, it does make sense that you would keep them around. So I'm following your logic here, Anthony. I like it.
That's really where it would come in. And the Death Shroud Terminators, I love the look of the models. I love it when they make it to melee combat. If they don't make it into melee combat, you're paying a lot of points for some durable models, but they're not doing a whole lot.
Correct.
On the table.
Absolutely.
So that's something that I might change in the future as well for this list.
Sure.
Perhaps swap those guys out for some blight. If you're going to keep Terminators in the list, Blight Lords instead. Just because they've got some decent shooting and can still melee to a decent degree.
Yes, they can.
So that's another thing that I would change. Again, Death Shroud, if they make it into combat, they're A+, but getting there is kind of a difficult task for them. They got to, usually with them, it's deep striking and then making the roll. You got to save back a command point for the re-roll and the charge to make sure that they get in. So, but yeah, hopefully that answers some questions. The list wouldn't change a whole lot. It would just be maxing out the Plague Marines and then kind of adjusting some things on the peripheral. So.
Absolutely. Well, Anthony, thank you for giving us your reflections on what you'd be doing differently, especially as we live into this new season we're all in right now. Now, before we go, of course, if folks, have heard your interview and say, I need to take that man down, I want to take on some,
Yeah.
I want to put some hand sanitizer on his Plague Marines and make them clean again. How would folks find you? How can somebody reach out and say, I want to take on Anthony Murphy?
Sure. So I'm on Discord at the Gamers of the Eastern Fringe Discord, and my name is Sandman on there. So
Gotcha.
if folks want to contact me on there, I'm also available if folks want to contact me via email. My email is anthonymurphy.fsa@gmail.com. You can contact me by that way as well. I am hearing rumblings that there's going to be another league starting up sometime around October 1, and I do intend to be a part of that. I'll be part of Pod 2 in that forthcoming.
Well, yeah, so when you win Pod 3, you got to auto advance. You can't. There's no option to stay down there. You're moving up. So
moving on up.
We'll see you in Pod 2. That's where I competed in, and
okay.
It was a good league. My only caution to you, sir, of course, is be careful upsetting Grandpa Nurgle too much, moving up to number 7 for Plague Marines. If moving up to 10, I mean, hey, I played a Death Skull list, so I made sure there was lots of blue, and they were very lucky as a result of that. So just be careful losing your patronage there with
Oh
7s,
boy,
but we'll see.
I got to make it up some other way, right?
Exactly. Well, listeners, thank you. This again is just our first interview with one of our Summer League pod winners. We're going to have the other winners on in later episodes, but again, we're very grateful to have Anthony with us, taking us through his list, his games, and of course, what's going to change moving forward. But Anthony, thank you so much for being with us today, and listeners, until next time, take care of yourselves and continue to enjoy your hobby.